You stand before the king, Lisa of the Silver Moon. The chancellor's voice echoed in the grand hall, brittle and cold. Lisa didn't kneel. She met Alpha King Kane's gaze, a stare like crushed ice. His jaw clenched, the heavy gold of his crown seeming to weigh on his broad shoulders. The union is severed, Kane announced, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. The king requires a queen of strength, not a liability. I reject you, Lisa. A collective gasp swept the assembled court. Lisa felt the ceremonial silver chain snap at her collarbone, a physical manifestation of the broken bond. She didn't weep. She offered a tight, terrifying smile. "As you wish, Your Majesty," she whispered, turning her back on the most powerful man in the realms. "May you find exactly what you deserve." The iron gates of the Blackwood Citadel clanged shut behind Lisa, the sound final and hollow. The damp air of the northern territories clung to her, smelling of pine needles and impending snow. She pulled her thin cloak tighter, the fabric inadequate against the biting wind, just as her upbringing had been inadequate for the brutal realities of the Alpha King's court. She was alone. The carriage that had brought her here, filled with the hopeful murmurs of her father and the nervous chatter of her handmaidens, was gone, banished. She was a rejected bride, a source of shame for the Silver Moon Pack, a discarded pawn in a game she hadn't asked to play. Inside the citadel, Kane stood by the massive arched window of his study, watching the small, solitary figure disappear down the winding mountain path. His wolf, usually a silent, powerful presence, was restless, pacing within his mind. Wrong, it growled, a low, unsettling vibration. Wrong choice. Kane crushed the silver chain he held in his hand, the chain that had briefly linked them. "Silence," he muttered. Though whether to his wolf or himself, he wasn't sure. He needed a warrior queen, someone to stand beside him against the encroaching rogue factions in the east. Lisa was delicate, soft-spoken, her scent like rain-washed lilacs, too fragile for the throne. He had chosen pragmatism over the faint, almost imperceptible tug of a mate bond. It was the duty of a king. Lisa didn't look back. She focused on placing one foot in front of the other, the gravel crunching under her boots. The rejection stung, a dull, throbbing ache in her chest where a mate bond should have flourished. But beneath the pain, a strange, terrifying sense of liberation began to bloom. She was no longer bound by her father's ambitions or the rigid expectations of court life. She was simply Lisa. She walked until her legs burned, and the citadel was a dark smudge against the gray sky. As dusk fell, casting long, menacing shadows across the path, she reached the edge of the whispering woods. The trees here were ancient, their gnarled roots twisting over the rocky ground, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the dying light. This was rogue territory, a place where civilized wolves didn't venture. A low growl sounded from the underbrush, a sound that bypassed logic and went straight to her primal instincts. Lisa froze, her hand instinctively dropping to the small silver dagger hidden beneath her cloak. Her father had insisted she carry it, a token gesture of protection. 3 wolves emerged from the shadows. They were gaunt, their fur matted, their eyes burning with a desperate, feral hunger. Rogues. They didn't circle. They advanced, a coordinated, predatory movement. Lisa drew the dagger, the metal cold and inadequate in her trembling hand. "Back away," she commanded, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. The largest wolf, a scarred gray male, sneered, shifting into his human form. a man with hollow cheeks and eyes that held no mercy. "A little lost lamb," he rasped. "You smell like the citadel, but you carry no pack scent, a discard." "I am Lisa of the Silver Moon," she said, her voice steadier now. "And I am not to be trifled with." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Silver Moon? Soft, easy meat." He lunged. Lisa didn't cower. She sidestepped, a move she'd practiced in secret, away from the disapproving eyes of her instructors. She brought the dagger up, catching the man across his forearm. He howled in pain, stumbling back. The other two wolves snarled, preparing to attack. Lisa backed against a massive oak, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was outnumbered, outmatched. She closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. Suddenly, a roar shook the very leaves on the trees, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. The ground trembled. Lisa opened her eyes to see a massive black wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, standing between her and the rogues. Its eyes, burning like molten gold, were fixed on the attackers. The air crackled with power, a heavy, suffocating dominance that forced the rogues to their knees. The black wolf didn't attack. It didn't need to. The sheer force of its presence was enough. The rogues whimpered, scrambling backward before turning and vanishing into the darkening woods. The black wolf turned slowly toward Lisa. It didn't shift. It just stared at her, its golden eyes piercing through the gloom. The scent of pine and ozone washed over her, a scent that was terrifyingly familiar. It was Cain. He took a step toward her, his massive head lowering, a low whine escaping his throat. Lisa gripped her dagger tighter, her knuckles white. She didn't lower her weapon. She met his golden gaze with her own icy stare. "You rejected me, King Cain," she said, her voice ringing clear in the silent woods. "Do not presume to protect me now." Cain shifted, the transition smooth and powerful, leaving him standing before her in simple dark clothes, his crown absent. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating the harsh lines of his face. He looked dangerous, a stark contrast to the regal king in the grand hall. "Put the knife down, Lisa," he commanded, the habit of authority deeply ingrained. "No," she replied, her voice firm. She kept the dagger raised, a small silver barrier between them. Cain's jaw tightened. This was not the submissive, fragile girl who had stood before him mere hours ago. "You are in rogue territory. It's not safe." "I am well aware of my location," Lisa countered. "And considering my current situation, safe is a relative term." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration. I felt a disturbance. My patrols reported movement. And you came personally?" Lisa arched an eyebrow. How diligent of the king to check on his discarded trash. The words hit him like a physical blow. He flinched, the subtle movement not escaping her notice. "I did what was necessary for the kingdom," he said, his voice hardening, defensive. "You did what you thought was necessary for you," she corrected softly. "You looked at me and saw weakness. You saw a liability. I saw a woman who would crumble under the weight of the crown," he countered, stepping closer. The air between them hummed with unresolved tension. Lisa didn't back down. "You didn't look closely enough." She turned away from him, sheathing the dagger with a definitive click. She began to walk deeper into the woods, following a narrow, almost invisible trail. "Where are you going?" Cain demanded, following her. "You can't survive out here." "I will manage," she said over her shoulder. I suggest you return to your citadel, Your Majesty. Your warrior queen awaits. Cain caught her arm, his grip firm but not bruising. A jolt of electricity shot up Lisa's arm at the contact, a startling, unwanted reaction. She yanked her arm free, glaring at him. "Do not touch me." Cain stared at his hand, as if surprised by the sensation. His wolf was pacing frantically now, howling against the confinement of his mind. "Mate," it urged. "Protect. I am taking you back." Cain stated, his tone brooking no argument. "You will stay in the guest quarters until safe passage to the Silver Moon Pack can be arranged." "I am not going back to my father," Lisa said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Cain frowned. "Why not?" Lisa hesitated. How could she explain the stifling confinement of her home? The constant pressure to be perfect, to secure a powerful alliance. Her father hadn't sent her to be a queen. He had sent her to be a hostage, a guarantee of the Alpha King's favor. "That is none of your concern," she said finally. "Everything in my territory is my concern," Cain replied. "And currently, you are a vulnerable female wandering alone in the woods." "I am not vulnerable," Lisa snapped, her composure finally cracking. "I survived my father's court. I survived your rejection. I will survive this." She pointed a shaking finger at him. "You think you know strength, Cain? You think strength is roaring and posturing and crushing those who disagree with you. You have no idea what real strength is." Cain stood perfectly still, absorbing her words. No one spoke to him like this. No one dared. And yet, looking at her, flushed with anger, her eyes flashing in the moonlight, he felt a strange, terrifying pull. He had rejected her because she was weak, but the woman standing before him was anything but. "Perhaps," he said slowly, his voice a low rumble, "I was mistaken." Lisa scoffed. "A little late for revelations, Your Majesty." She turned and continued down the path. This time, Cain didn't stop her. He followed silently, keeping his distance, a dark shadow dogging her steps. They walked for hours, the silence stretching taut between them. Lisa's muscles ached, and her feet were blistered, but she refused to stop. She would not show weakness in front of him. As dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gray, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, the roof sagging, the windows boarded up. Lisa swayed, exhaustion finally taking its toll. She stumbled, her knees buckling. Before she hit the ground, Cain was there. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her, strong and secure. The scent of pine and ozone enveloped her, and despite her anger, despite the rejection, she felt a dangerous, terrifying sense of comfort. She pushed against his chest, trying to free herself. "Let me go." "You're exhausted," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her toward the cabin. "I can walk," she protested, her voice weak. "I know you can," Cain replied. "But right now you don't have to." He kicked the door open, the wood splintering. Inside, the cabin was dusty and bare, save for a rickety cot in the corner. Cain gently laid her down, taking his cloak and draping it over her. Lisa watched him, her eyes heavy. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Cain looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Because," he said softly, "I am beginning to realize that I may have made a very grave error." He turned and walked out the door, leaving Lisa alone in the quiet cabin, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The morning sun filtered through the gaps in the boarded windows, casting dusty beams across the small cabin. Lisa woke with a start. disoriented, the events of the previous day rushing back with the force of a physical blow. The rejection. The rogues. Cain. She sat up, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. Cain's heavy cloak slipped from her shoulders. It smelled of him, that intoxicating blend of pine, ozone, and power. She pushed it away, a flush of anger heating her cheeks. She didn't want his protection. She didn't want his pity. The cabin door opened, and Cain ducked inside. He carried a dead rabbit by the hind legs and a bundle of dry wood. He looked out of place in the meager surroundings, a king reduced to a scavenger. "You're awake," he stated, his voice neutral. He tossed the wood into the small stone hearth and began preparing the rabbit. "What are you doing?" Lisa asked, her voice raspy from sleep. "Breakfast," he replied, not looking up. "I didn't ask for your help," she reminded him, swinging her legs off the cot. "And I didn't offer it," Cain countered smoothly, striking a flint. A small fire crackled to life. "I'm hungry. If you wish to starve, that's your prerogative." Lisa scowled, wrapping her thin arms around herself. The chill of the morning had seeped into her bones. She watched him work, his movements efficient and practiced. For a king who supposedly spent his days in council meetings and training yards, he seemed remarkably adept at survival. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Cain paused, his knife hovering over the meat. He looked at her, his golden eyes guarded. "A king must know his kingdom, Lisa. All of it. Not just the polished floors of the citadel." He finished preparing the rabbit and skewered it over the fire. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. "My father will be looking for me," Lisa said finally. Cain snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Your father is currently negotiating a trade agreement with the Eastern Pax. He accepted the severed bond with remarkable speed, provided I maintained the trade tariffs." Lisa flinched. The confirmation of her father's indifference stung, even though she had expected it. She was a commodity, easily traded and easily discarded. "Then I will go somewhere else," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "Where?" Cain asked, turning the skewer. "To the rogues? To another pack that will treat you as a bargaining chip? The world is not kind to solitary females, Lisa." "I am aware of the world's cruelty, Your Majesty," she snapped. "I have experienced it firsthand." Cain's jaw tightened. "I did not reject you out of cruelty." "No, you did it out of arrogance," she retorted. "You assumed you knew what was best. You assumed I was weak, and you have proven me wrong." Cain admitted, his voice low. Lisa stared at him, surprised by the concession. "Then why are you still here? If you've realized your mistake, shouldn't you be rushing back to find your warrior queen?" Cain looked up, his gaze locking with hers. "Perhaps I've realized that a warrior isn't always the one holding a sword." Before Lisa could process his words, a low howl echoed through the woods. It wasn't a rogue howl. It was disciplined, coordinated. A pack call. Cain stood up abruptly, kicking dirt over the fire to extinguish it. "We have to move." "Who is it?" Lisa asked, alarm spiking in her chest. "My trackers," Cain said, his expression grim. "My council doesn't know I left the citadel. They will assume the worst." "That I kidnapped you?" Lisa asked, a hysterical laugh escaping her lips. "The discarded bride overpowers the Alpha King?" "That rogues ambushed me," Cain corrected, grabbing his cloak. And if they find you here with me, they won't ask questions. They'll assume you were involved." He held out a hand to her. "Come." Lisa hesitated, looking at his outstretched hand. Trusting him felt like a betrayal of herself. But staying meant facing the wrath of the Alpha King's guard. She ignored his hand and stood up on her own. "Lead the way." They slipped out of the back of the cabin, moving swiftly through the dense undergrowth. Cain moved with surprising stealth for a man of his size, his senses on high alert. Lisa followed closely, her heart hammering against her ribs. They ran for what felt like hours, the sounds of the trackers occasionally drifting through the trees, always too close for comfort. Cain led them toward the mountainous region, the terrain becoming steeper and more treacherous. As they scrambled up a rocky incline, Lisa lost her footing. She slid backward, crying out as sharp rocks tore at her hands. Cain was there in an instant, catching her before she could fall further. He pulled her up, his grip tight. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice strained. "I'm fine," she gasped, pulling her hands away. They were scraped and bleeding, but she refused to show him any weakness. Cain looked at her hands, his expression darkening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, clean cloth. Without a word, he took her hand and began to gently wrap it. Lisa froze, stunned by the unexpected tenderness. His touch was warm, careful. She looked up at his face, noticing the tense set of his jaw, the worry in his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, her voice a whisper. "You rejected me. You don't owe me anything." Cain finished tying the cloth and looked at her, his golden eyes intense. "Because, Lisa," he said, his voice raw, "I am beginning to suspect that I rejected the very thing I need." He dropped her hand and turned away. "Keep moving. They're getting closer." Lisa stared at his broad back as he continued up the incline. The world had shifted on its axis. The Alpha King had rejected her, but now it seemed he couldn't let her go. And the terrifying truth was, she wasn't sure she wanted him to. The incline grew brutal, the loose shale giving way under every step. Lisa's breath tore through her throat, tasting of iron and dust. She refused to look down, focusing only on Cain's broad back as he forged the path ahead. The tracker's howls had faded, swallowed by the rising wind of the high altitudes. But the silence felt equally oppressive. "We need to reach the cave system before nightfall," Cain called back, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "The temperature drops rapidly up here." Lisa didn't answer, saving her breath for the climb. Her wrapped hand throbbed, a dull counterpoint to the sharp ache in her thighs. She had spent her life navigating the social intricacies of the Silver Moon Court, not scaling the jagged peaks of the Blackwood territory. Yet, the physical strain was almost a relief compared to the chaotic swirl of her thoughts. "I am beginning to suspect that I rejected the very thing I need." His words replayed in her mind, a relentless echo. What did he need? A pawn, a captive? Or was he playing a new game, one where she was still the prize, just on a different board? They breached the timberline, the trees replaced by stark, gray stone. The wind hit them full force, biting through Lisa's thin dress. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering. Cain stopped, waiting for her to catch up. He stripped off his heavy leather vest and held it out. "Put it on." "I don't need your clothes," she said, her voice shaking despite her attempt at defiance. "Don't be a fool, Lisa. You'll freeze." He didn't wait for her to take it. He stepped close, dropping the heavy garment over her shoulders. The residual heat of his body enveloped her, smelling intensely of him. It was maddeningly comforting. "Why?" she asked, her voice tight as she pulled the vest closer. "Why are you doing this? If your council finds you with me, they'll think you've gone mad. Or worse, that you're weak." Cain held her gaze, the wind whipping his dark hair. "I made a decision based on fear, Lisa. Fear of weakness, fear of what my council expected, fear of a bond I didn't understand. I am rectifying that mistake. You don't rectify rejecting a mate like you fix a broken wagon wheel." She snapped, the hurt she'd been suppressing finally bleeding into her voice. "You severed the bond. You broke the chain." "I broke the physical chain," he corrected, his voice low, urgent. The bond is something else entirely. I feel it, Lisa. Don't tell me you don't." She looked away. She felt it. It was a constant, low-level thrumming beneath her skin. A magnetic pull that made every step away from him an effort of will. But she wouldn't admit it. Admitting it gave him power. "I feel cold, Your Majesty. That is all." Cain's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He turned and resumed the climb. They reached the cave, just as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent streaks of crimson and bruised purple. The cave entrance was a narrow fissure in the rock face, barely wide enough for Cain to squeeze through. Inside, it was dry and pitch black. Cain produced a small flint and steel from his pocket, striking a spark that illuminated a small cache of dry wood. "A remnant from past patrols," he explained, as the fire flared to life, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Lisa sank onto a relatively flat rock, exhausted beyond measure. She watched Cain as he meticulously arranged the wood, building the fire up to a steady blaze. He was a mass of contradictions. The ruthless alpha king who had discarded her in front of his entire court, and the man who had just carried her up a mountain and surrendered his only source of warmth. "We stay here tonight," Cain announced, sitting across the fire from her. "Tomorrow, we cross the ridge. There is a neutral territory outpost there. We can send a secure message to your father." "I told you, I am not going back to my father," Lisa said, the firelight catching the steely glint in her eyes. "Then where?" Cain asked, his frustration leaking through. "You cannot survive out here alone. You saw the rogues." "I'll go to the Eastern Covens," she said, naming the territories occupied by witches, a place wolves rarely went. "I have skills I can learn." Cain let out a harsh laugh. "The Covens? They'll eat you alive, Lisa. They despise wolves." "They despise alpha wolves," she corrected softly. "I am just a discarded bride. I pose no threat." Cain went very still. The fire crackled, emphasizing the sudden silence. He leaned forward, his golden eyes intense in the flickering light. "You are not discarded," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that stirred something primal within her. "And you are definitely a threat." "A threat to what?" "To everything I thought I knew," he murmured. Before she could dissect his words, a sound echoed from the cave entrance. It was faint at first, barely a scrape of stone on stone. But then it came again, louder, closer. Cain stood instantly, kicking dirt over the fire until it was nothing but a dull red glow. He motioned for Lisa to stay back, drawing a long hunting knife from his boot. The scrape sounded again, followed by a low, guttural snarl that didn't sound entirely wolf, nor entirely human. "What is that?" Lisa whispered, fear finally piercing her exhaustion. Cain didn't answer. He positioned himself between her and the narrow entrance, his body coiled tight, ready to strike. The air in the cave grew thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and impending violence. The Alpha King was no longer a conflicted man. He was a predator, protecting his own. And God help whatever was coming through that narrow fissure. The creature squeezed through the narrow opening, a contorted mass of sinew and bone. It wasn't a wolf, not entirely. It moved on two legs, hunched over, its skin a mottled, sickly gray in the dim red glow of the dying fire. Its eyes, completely black, reflected no light. Lisa clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. It was a Wendigo, a cursed creature, born of desperation and cannibalism, a myth told to frighten pups in the nursery. They weren't supposed to be real. Cain didn't hesitate. He didn't roar or posture. He moved with lethal, silent efficiency. As the creature lunged, elongated claws swiping at the air, Cain ducked under the attack, driving his hunting knife upward into its ribs. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and backhanded Cain, sending him crashing against the cavern wall. Cain grunted, shaking off the impact instantly. He was up before the creature could turn, shifting mid-stride. The massive black wolf hit the Wendigo like a freight train, jaws snapping shut on its shoulder. The cave echoed with sickening crunches and frantic thrashing. Lisa watched, paralyzed by terror and awe. Cain in his wolf form was terrifying, a force of raw, unbridled nature. The Wendigo was unnaturally strong, tearing at Cain's thick fur, black blood splattering the stone floor. Cain growled, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in Lisa's chest and shook the creature violently. With a final, sickening snap, the Wendigo went limp. Cain dropped the carcass, panting heavily. He shifted back to his human form, leaning heavily against the rock wall. The fire's embers cast long, distorted shadows across his torso. He was bleeding from several deep gashes on his chest and arms. Lisa didn't think. She reacted. She scrambled over the uneven floor, pulling his leather vest tightly around herself as she knelt beside him. "You're hurt," she breathed, her hands hovering uncertainly over the wounds. "It's shallow," Cain rasped, though his tight voice betrayed the pain. "It will heal." He tried to stand but staggered, his legs giving out. He slid down the wall, clutching his side. "Stop moving," Lisa commanded, a sharp edge to her voice that surprised them both. She tore a strip from the hem of her already ruined dress. "Let me see." She carefully pulled his hand away. The gash was deep, oozing dark, sluggish blood. The creature's claws had been filthy. Infection was a real threat, even for an alpha's accelerated healing. "I need water," she said, looking around the dark cave. "My canteen, by the fire pit." Cain pointed weakly. She retrieved it, along with the small piece of cloth he'd used for her hands earlier. She worked quickly, her hands remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She cleaned the wound as best she could, ignoring Cain's sharp intakes of breath. "You should have run," Cain murmured, his eyes closed as she bound the wound with the torn fabric of her dress. "And missed the opportunity to see the Alpha King bested by a myth?" She retorted softly, tying the knot tight. He opened his eyes, looking at her. They were close. So close she could feel the heat radiating from him. Smell the metallic tang of blood mixed with his scent. "I wasn't bested," he argued weakly, a ghost of his usual arrogance surfacing. "You're sitting on a dirty cave floor, bleeding, while I bandage you with my dress," she pointed out. "I'd call it a draw." A weak chuckle escaped his lips. turning into a groan. You are infuriating. Lisa of the Silver Moon, you rejected me. You don't get to complain about my personality now, she said, sitting back on her heels. Silence stretched between them, heavier than before. The immediate danger had passed, leaving in its wake a terrifying intimacy. They were alone in the dark, stripped of their titles and the expectations of their respective courts. They were just Cain and Lisa, bound by circumstances and a bond he had tried and failed to break. Why didn't you kneel? Cain asked suddenly, his voice soft in the darkness. Lisa looked at him, confused. When? In the hall, when I rejected you. You stood there. You looked me in the eye. No one does that. Lisa looked down at her hands, still stained with his blood. My father spent my entire life telling me to bow, to submit, to be the perfect, malleable bride for the Alpha King. He told me it was my only purpose. She looked up, meeting his gaze. When you broke the bond, you took away my purpose, but you also took away the requirement to submit. So, I didn't. Cain stared at her, the golden flecks in his eyes catching the faint red glow of the embers. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had looked for strength in muscles and battle prowess, and he had completely missed the quiet, unbreakable steel in the woman standing before him. He reached out, his large hand gently cupping her jaw. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, a startlingly tender gesture. I was blind, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Lisa's breath hitched. She should pull away. She should remind him of his cruelty, of his arrogance. But the pull was too strong, the bond humming to life beneath his touch. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes as a single tear escaped, tracing a path down her dirt-streaked face. Cain leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a hesitant, exploring touch, a stark contrast to the violence that had just occurred. It was a question, an apology, a desperate clinging to the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Lisa gasped softly, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his shoulders. The kiss deepened, the hesitant touch igniting into a sudden, consuming fire. It tasted of blood and desperation, of fear and an undeniable, ancient connection. For a moment, they were lost in it, the cold cave and the dead creature forgotten. Then, a loud crack echoed from outside the cave entrance, followed by a voice that cut through the silence like a whip. Find them. The king's trail leads this way. Cain broke the kiss, his body instantly tense. He looked at the narrow opening, then back at Lisa. The vulnerability gone from his eyes, replaced by a fierce, protective calculation. The king's guards had found them. And if they found Lisa here, alone with him, bleeding and hiding, there would be no explaining away the situation. She wouldn't just be a rejected bride, she would be a suspected traitor. You have to hide, Cain commanded, his voice returning to its authoritative edge. I'm not leaving you, Lisa said, panic rising in her chest. They won't hurt me. I am their king, he said quickly, struggling to his feet. He pointed to a small crevice near the back of the cave, barely visible in the gloom. Get in there. Do not make a sound, no matter what happens. Cain, do it, Lisa, he ordered, his eyes flashing gold. If you ever trusted me, trust me now. She hesitated for a split second, then scrambled toward the crevice, squeezing herself into the tight space just as the first guard shoved his way through the cave entrance, a torch illuminating the blood-soaked floor and the dead Wendigo. Lisa held her breath. pressing herself flat against the cold stone, watching as the Alpha King turned to face his men, a dangerous, unpredictable gamble playing out in the flickering light. The cave flooded with torchlight, painting the rough stone walls in harsh oranges and deep blacks. 3 of Kane's elite guards squeezed through the entrance, their swords drawn, their expressions a mix of panic and lethal readiness. The lead guard, a seasoned warrior named Marcus, stopped dead, taking in the scene. The slain Wendigo, the blood splattered across the floor, and his Alpha King, standing tall despite the visible wounds on his chest. "My king," Marcus gasped, dropping to one knee, the others quickly following suit. "We tracked you. We thought the worst. As you can see, Marcus, I am entirely capable of handling my own affairs," Kane said, his voice cold, steady, carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. He leaned casually against the rock wall, hiding his injured side from their direct line of sight. Lisa watched from the narrow crevice, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She barely dared to breathe. Kane was magnificent, an unbroken facade of power, completely obscuring the vulnerable man who had kissed her moments ago. "The beast," Marcus began, eyeing the Wendigo with a mixture of disgust and awe. "They haven't been seen this far south in decades. A scout, perhaps." Kane lied smoothly. "I caught its scent while on a perimeter check and tracked it here. It seems the northern borders require tightening." "Alone, sire? Without your guard?" Another guard, younger, dared to ask. Kane's golden eyes snapped to the young guard, the resulting silence heavy and suffocating. "Are you questioning my methods, Corin?" The guard swallowed hard, lowering his head. "No, my king. Forgive me. I require a perimeter check immediately," Kane ordered, pushing off the wall. He winced internally, the movement pulling at his crudely bandaged wounds, but his face remained impassive. "Ensure there are no others. Then, prepare for the descent. I will follow shortly." "Sire, your wounds," Marcus protested, rising slowly. "Let me," I said. "Prepare for the descent, Marcus." Kane cut him off, a low growl threading through his voice. "I need a moment to center myself before the climb." It was a plausible excuse. Alphas often needed isolation after a brutal kill to calm their wolves. Marcus hesitated, clearly torn between duty and the king's direct order. Finally, he bowed his head. "As you command, my king." The guards filed out, the scrape of stone echoing as they squeezed back through the narrow entrance. The flickering light faded, leaving the cave plunged back into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the faint, dying embers of the fire. Kane waited until the sounds of their descent faded entirely. He sagged against the wall, the adrenaline leaving him in a sudden rush. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hand going to his bandaged side. Lisa slipped out of this crevice, moving silently across the stone floor. She stopped a few feet from him, the memory of their kiss burning between them in the cold air. "That was incredibly foolish," she said, her voice a quiet reprimand in the silence. Kane opened his eyes, a tired smirk playing on his lips. "It worked, didn't it?" "Barely," she retorted. "If they had looked closer, if they had smelled me." "They didn't," he countered. He pushed himself off standing tall despite the pain. He looked at her, his expression serious. "We don't have much time. They will wait at the base of the ridge. I have to go back with them." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Lisa felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest, a profound sense of loss that shocked her. She had spent the last 2 days trying to escape him. But the thought of him leaving now felt unbearable. "So, the game is over," she said, her voice flat, masking the turmoil within. "You return to your citadel, to your council, and to your search for a warrior queen." Cain stepped closer, the space between them shrinking rapidly. "The game has changed, Lisa." "Has it?" she challenged, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. "You hid me because you were ashamed, because a king cannot be seen with the bride he publicly humiliated and discarded." Cain's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He reached out, his hand gripping her shoulder, pulling her slightly closer. "I hid you because if my council knew you were here, they would use you against me. They would see you as a weakness they could exploit. I hid you to protect you. I don't need your protection." She repeated the familiar refrain, but it lacked its usual sting. "I know you don't," he admitted, his thumb brushing against her collarbone, near where the silver chain had once rested. "You survived the Blackwood. You faced down rogues. You patched up an alpha king. You are stronger than anyone in my court." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm on her face, smelling of pine and ozone. "I made a terrible mistake, Lisa. I let fear dictate my actions. I severed a bond I didn't understand because I thought it made me weak. But I realize now, my weakness is being without you." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. He was laying himself bare, stripping away the armor of the Alpha King. "You broke the bond," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "You can't just undo that." "I can try," he said softly, his lips brushing against hers in a fleeting, agonizing touch. "I will try. But right now, you need to be safe." He stepped back, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, heavy silver ring, bearing the crest of the Blackwood pack. "Take this," he said, pressing it into her palm. "Follow the ridge west. You will find a small village, protected by a pack loyal only to me. Show the Alpha this ring. He will give you sanctuary." Lisa looked at the ring, the cold metal heavy in her hand. "And you?" "I go back to the citadel," Cain said, his eyes hardening, the king returning. "I deal with my council. I secure my throne." He paused, looking at her with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "And then, I come for you." "What if I don't want you to?" she asked, the question a defensive mechanism, a final attempt to protect her fractured heart. Cain didn't answer immediately. He reached out, his knuckles brushing against her cheek, catching a stray tear. "Then I will have to convince you," he said, his voice a low, rumbling promise. He turned and walked toward the cave entrance, his silhouette a dark shadow against the faint light creeping in from the outside. He didn't look back as he squeezed through the fissure, leaving Lisa alone in the dark cave, a heavy silver ring burning in her palm. The Alpha King had rejected her. But as she watched him disappear into the approaching dawn, she knew with terrifying certainty that the true battle had just begun. And she was no longer a pawn. She was the queen he desperately needed to win back. The descent down the western face of the Blackwood Ridge was a grueling test of endurance. Without Cain's imposing presence to shield her from the biting wind, Lisa felt every degree of the plunging temperature. Her ruined dress was a liability, her hands still wrapped in his blood-stained cloth. But the heavy silver ring in her pocket felt like a talisman, its cold metal burning against her thigh with the promise of survival. It took her 2 days to find the settlement Cain had spoken of. It wasn't a village so much as a fortress carved directly into the side of a granite cliff. High walls of dark timber and iron spikes surrounded a cluster of stone dwellings. This was Iron Ridge, the most remote and fiercely loyal outpost in the Alpha King's territory. As she stumbled toward the heavy iron gates, two guards materialized from the shadows of the tree line, their spears leveled at her chest. "State your business, Stray," the taller one barked, his eyes scanning her torn clothes and dirt-streaked face. "This is a closed territory." Lisa didn't flinch. The fear that used to paralyze her in the Silver Moon Court had been burned away by the fires of the last week. She reached into her pocket, her fingers trembling slightly from exhaustion, and pulled out the ring. She held it up, the blackwood crest catching the pale afternoon light. "My business is with your Alpha," Lisa said, her voice dry but unwavering. "And you will lower your weapons." The guards' eyes widened as they recognized the king's seal. They lowered their spears instantly, the hostility vanishing, replaced by wary confusion. Alpha Tauren was a massive bear of a man, with a silver-streaked beard and a missing left eye. He sat in his rudimentary hall, turning the heavy ring over in his calloused hands. He looked from the ring to the battered, exhausted woman standing before his hearth. "The king's personal signet," Tauren rumbled, his single eye piercing her. "He does not give this away lightly. And yet, the scent on you, it is a tangled thing. You carry his mark, but the bond is broken." "He broke it," Lisa said simply, welcoming the warmth of the fire. "And then he sent me here to keep me out of his counsel's reach." Tauren leaned back in his heavy wooden chair. The discarded Silver Moon bride. Word travels fast, even to the edges of the world. They say he humiliated you, cast you out for being weak. "He made a miscalculation," Lisa replied, holding his gaze. Tauren let out a booming laugh that rattled the drinking horns on his table. "A miscalculation. I like you, girl. You have steel in your spine. You have sanctuary here as the king commands. My healers will tend to your wounds, and my provisioners will find you proper clothing." "Thank you, Alpha Tauren," Lisa said, bowing her head slightly, a gesture of respect, not submission. "But I ask for one thing more." Tauren raised an eyebrow. "Oh? I don't want to just hide here. I want to train. I want to know how to hold a blade without cutting myself. And I want to understand the terrain of the Blackwood borders." Tauren studied her for a long moment. He saw the bruises, the exhaustion, but he also saw the unyielding fire in her eyes. It was the look of a survivor. "The king sent me a sheltered princess to protect," Tauren mused softly. "It seems he accidentally sent me a fledgling warrior. Very well, Lisa of the Silver Moon. Tomorrow at dawn, you join the sparring ring. We will see if that steel in your spine can hold an edge." Over the next month, Lisa transformed. The delicate silks of her past were replaced by hardened leather and functional wool. Her hands, once soft and perfectly manicured, grew calloused from gripping wooden practice swords and hunting bows. She fell into the mud. She bruised. She bled. But she never complained. The women of Iron Ridge, fierce fighters in their own right, took her under their wing, teaching her the brutal, pragmatic combat of the North. She learned that true strength wasn't just physical dominance. It was endurance, adaptability, and the quiet resolve to stand back up every time you were knocked down. Yet, despite her physical exhaustion, her nights were plagued by dreams of golden eyes and the scent of pine. The bond Cain had severed physically still hummed in her soul, a phantom limb that ached in the dark. Rumors trickled in from the citadel with the supply merchants. The kingdom was unsettled. The Alpha King was acting erratically, purging members of his court and refusing all petitions from neighboring pacts offering new brides. The Chancellor, Lord Valerius, was reportedly gathering support among the old guard, whispering that the king had lost his mind to the Silver Moon curse. Lisa knew it wasn't a curse. It was the consequence of a broken soul. Cain was fighting a war on two fronts, one against his treacherous council, and one against the gaping hole in his own chest. And as the snows began to fall, blanketing Ironridge in a stark, beautiful white, Lisa knew the war was coming to her doorstep. In the grand audience chamber of the Blackwood Citadel, the air was thick with barely contained treason. Cain sat on his obsidian throne, his posture relaxed, but his golden eyes missed nothing. Chancellor Valerius, a gaunt man with a silver tongue and ambition as deep as the ocean, stood before the dais. "My king," Valerius purred, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "The eastern borders grow restless. The Silver Moon Pack has doubled its tariffs in retaliation for the unfortunate dissolution of your union. The realm needs stability. It needs a queen." "The realm needs loyalty, Valerius," Cain countered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Something I find increasingly lacking within these walls." Valerius offered a tight smile. "We are only concerned for your legacy, sire. You have been distracted since your solitary hunt in the Whispering Woods. Your wounds have healed, but your temper has not. The people whisper." "Let them whisper," Cain said, leaning forward. "Whispers do not win wars, and a war is exactly what you are inviting by continually pressing this issue." Since returning from the cave, Cain had played a brutal game of political chess. He had realized during his time with Lisa that the real weakness wasn't a soft bride. It was a council that believed they could manipulate their king. He had spent the last month quietly dismantling Valerius's network, discovering that the rogues in the woods hadn't been a random encounter. They had been paid to ensure the discarded bride never made it back to her father. They had tried to murder his mate. The realization had nearly driven his wolf feral. Only the thought of Lisa, safe in Ironridge, kept him anchored. He needed to secure the citadel before he could bring her back. He would not bring her into a viper's nest. "We merely suggest you look to the northern houses," Valerius pressed, unaware of how close he was to death. "Lady Alara is a proven warrior." "The audience is over, Chancellor," Cain snapped, standing abruptly. The sheer force of his alpha aura slammed into the room, forcing several younger council members to drop to their knees. Valerius paled but remained standing, his jaw tight. "As you command, my king," Valerius hissed, bowing stiffly before turning on his heel. Later that night, in the privacy of his war room, Cain's most trusted guard, Marcus, stepped out of the shadows. "Report," Cain ordered, staring at a map of his territories, his eyes lingering on the western marker for Ironridge. "You were right, sire," Marcus said, his voice grim. Valerius moved. He intercepted a missive from a merchant. He knows she is at Ironridge. Cain's head snapped up, his blood running cold. When did he find out? 2 days ago. He didn't mobilize the army. That would draw your attention. He sent the Shadow Guard, a dozen of his personal assassins. They are moving under the cover of the incoming blizzard. The Shadow Guard, elite killers who struck without a sound. They wouldn't care about Ironridge's defenses. They would slip over the walls in the dead of night and slaughter everyone in their path to get to Lisa. Cain didn't hesitate. He didn't summon the council or call for a formal mobilization. He unrolled his heavy winter cloak and strapped his broadsword to his back. "Gather the elite," Cain ordered, his golden eyes blazing with a terrifying, unholy light. "Every man still loyal to the crown. We ride for Ironridge immediately." "Sire, the blizzard," Marcus protested mildly. "I am the storm, Marcus." Cain snarled, his fangs flashing in the dim light. "And God have mercy on anyone who stands between me and my queen." Miles away, the blizzard was already battering the high walls of Iron Ridge. Lisa stood on the battlements next to Torin, her leather hood pulled tight against the howling wind. The snow was falling so thickly they couldn't see 10 feet past the gates. "Go inside, Lisa," Torin yelled over the wind. "This is no weather for sentry duty." "Something is wrong," Lisa replied, peering into the swirling white void. Her heart was racing, an inexplicable panic rising in her chest. It wasn't the weather. It was a deep, instinctual warning. The broken bond was vibrating violently. Suddenly, a muffled cry sounded from the eastern watchtower. Then, silence. Torin cursed, drawing his massive broadsword. "Sound the alarm," he roared to the guard below. But before the horn could be blown, shadows detached themselves from the falling snow on the walls. Men cloaked entirely in white dropped onto the battlements, their curved blades flashing in the torchlight. The shadow guard had arrived. "Get to the keep," Torin bellowed, shoving Lisa toward the stairs as he engaged the first 2 assassins. Lisa stumbled down the icy steps, drawing the short sword she had trained with. She wasn't the helpless girl in the woods anymore, but she knew she was no match for trained assassins. The courtyard was chaos. The assassins had bypassed the gates entirely. The warriors of Iron Ridge, caught off guard in the storm, were fighting desperately in small pockets. Lisa backed toward the heavy doors of the main hall, her sword raised. 3 figures in white spotted her and detached from the main skirmish, their movements fluid and predatory. They knew exactly who their target was. "I won't make this easy," Lisa whispered to herself, dropping into a defensive stance she had drilled 1,000 times. She was terrified, but she was not broken. If she died tonight, she would die fighting on her own terms. The lead assassin lunged. Lisa parried the first strike, the harsh clang of metal ringing out over the howling wind. The impact sent a painful shock up her arm, but she held her ground, pivoting to dodge a secondary slash from the assassin's left hand. She was faster than she used to be, her reflexes honed by Torin's brutal training. But she was outmatched. The 3 assassins moved with a synchronized, deadly grace, driving her backward step by step toward the heavy oak doors of the keep. One of them fainted low, causing Lisa to drop her guard for a fraction of a second. The second assassin capitalized, his curved blade slicing a shallow gash across her shoulder. Lisa gasped, stumbling back against the unforgiving wood of the door. The assassins closed in, raising their weapons for the killing blow. Lisa stared them down, her chest heaving, refusing to close her eyes. Suddenly, the heavy wooden gates of the Iron Ridge courtyard exploded inward in a shower of splinters and iron hinges. A massive black wolf, larger than any natural beast, tore through the wreckage, surrounded by a dozen of the king's elite guard. The black wolf didn't pause to assess the battlefield. It locked onto the 3 white-cloaked figures pinning Lisa against the door and crossed the courtyard in 3 massive bounds. The impact was devastating. Cain, in his wolf form, hit the assassins with the force of a battering ram, crushing armor and bone alike. He tossed one man aside like a rag doll and clamped his massive jaws around the neck of another. The courtyard erupted. The arrival of the Alpha King and his elite turned the tide instantly. The Shadow Guard, realizing they were outmatched, tried to retreat. But the enraged wolves of Iron Ridge and the King's men showed no mercy. Cain shifted back to his human form amidst the blood and snow. He was a terrifying sight, covered in gore, his eyes glowing with unrestrained fury. He ignored the chaos around him, his gaze locking instantly onto Lisa. He crossed the distance between them, falling to his knees before her. His hands hovered over her, frantic, searching for fatal wounds. "Lisa," he choked out, his voice cracking as he saw the blood seeping from her shoulder. "Lisa, I'm here. You're safe." Lisa dropped her sword, the adrenaline finally crashing. She slid down the door to sit on the snowy ground, staring at the man who had torn the world apart to reach her. "You took your time, Your Majesty," she breathed, a weak, trembling smile touching her lips. Cain let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck, not caring who saw. The scent of her, lilacs beneath blood and snow, was the only thing grounding him. "I purged the council." Cain whispered fiercely against her skin. "Valerius is dead. The traitors are dead. There is no one left to question my reign or my choice." He pulled back, cupping her face in his large, warm hands. He looked at her not as a delicate prize, but as a warrior who had stood her ground against his enemies. "I was a fool," Cain said, his voice carrying clearly over the dying sounds of battle, ensuring every warrior in the courtyard heard him. "I thought a queen needed to wield a broadsword to be strong. I didn't realize true strength was surviving a broken bond, surviving the wilds and surviving me. I severed the bond out of fear, and I have bled every day since." Lisa looked into his golden eyes, seeing the raw vulnerability he was exposing to his entire pack. He was laying his pride, his crown, and his heart at her feet. "You told me a severed bond couldn't be fixed like a broken wagon wheel," Cain continued, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. "You were right. It can't be fixed. It has to be rebuilt, from the ground up, not by a decree from a king, but by a choice." He reached into his tunic and pulled out the delicate silver chain he had snapped in the grand hall months ago. He had repaired it, the silver links polished and whole. "I am not asking you to submit, Lisa of the Silver Moon," Cain said, holding the chain out to her. "I am asking you to stand beside me, to rule with me, not as my subject, but as my equal. Will you accept the bond? Will you be my queen?" Silence descended on the courtyard, broken only by the whistling wind. Torin, bleeding from a cut over his good eye, watched with bated breath, as did Marcus and the elite guard. Lisa looked at the silver chain, then up at Cain. She remembered the terrified girl who had walked out of the citadel gates, and she knew that girl was gone forever. In her place was a woman forged in ice and survival. She didn't need him to protect her anymore, which meant, she realized with a jolt of profound clarity, that if she chose him, it was because she truly wanted him. Lisa reached out, her fingers closing over the silver chain. She didn't bow her head. She kept her eyes locked on his. "On one condition," Lisa said, her voice steady and clear. Cain didn't hesitate. "Name it." "No more games. No more hiding behind fear or the expectations of a council. If we rule together. We trust each other. Or I walk back out those gates, and this time, you won't find me." A slow, devastating smile spread across Cain's face, a smile of pure reverence. "I swear it on my life, my wolf, and my crown." Lisa nodded, handing him the chain. "Then put it back on." As Cain fastened the silver chain around her neck, a shockwave of warmth radiated through both of them. It wasn't the tentative, fragile connection they had shared before. It was a blazing inferno, a bond forged in fire and tempered in ice. The phantom ache in Lisa's chest vanished, replaced by the heavy, comforting presence of her mate. Cain pulled her to her feet, wrapping his cloak around her shivering form. He turned to face his men, pulling Lisa flush against his side. Alpha Tauren was the first to act. He drove his broadsword into the snowy ground and dropped to one knee. "Long live the king," Tauren roared. He looked up at Lisa, a fierce grin splitting his weathered face. "And long live the Queen of the North." Marcus and the elite guard followed suit, the chant echoing into the stormy night. Lisa leaned her head against Cain's chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. She had come to the North as a pawn, was discarded as a liability, but she had fought her way back. She was Lisa of the Blackwood now, and as she looked out at her fiercely loyal people, she knew the Alpha King hadn't just found his bride. He had finally found his equal. The reign of King Cain and Queen Lisa became legendary across the territories. They rebuilt the Blackwood court not on fear and rigid tradition, but on mutual respect and unyielding strength. Lisa never lost the steel she found in Iron Ridge. She became a queen who could navigate deadly political summits as easily as she could command a battlefield. Cain never again doubted the quiet resilience of his mate, proving that the most unbreakable bonds are those chosen freely, long after the chains of expectation are shattered. If you enjoyed this story of survival, betrayal, and a fiercely fought romance, please give this video a like. Share it with fellow romance and fantasy lovers, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, original audio stories. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Lisa's transformation.